Hello, in this video, I'm going to be talking about some of the major neurotransmitters associated with some of the major actions of drug activation and drug transmission. So I'm going to be going over agonists and antagonists first, and then I'm going to be talking about acetylcholine, the monoamines, which as I said are those three neurotransmitters that are closely related, norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. I'm going to be talking a little bit about endorphins and then GABA and glutamate. So as I've said in the previous video, a lot of these drugs and a lot of these neurotransmitters are closely interconnected. A drug that affects one neurotransmitter is very likely to affect others as well. And the clearest way we see that is in the monoamines, where most drugs that have some sort of effect on serotonin have an effect on dopamine and norepinephrine, and vice versa. So it's not often as simple, unfortunately, as the cocaine makes the serotonin more effective, and that's the only effect. Rather, it's that all of these neurotransmitters have complex, diffuse mechanisms of action throughout the body. And all of these neurotransmitters are affected by drugs that often affect other neurotransmitter systems as well. So, what's important to bear in mind is the major actions of most of these neurotransmitters and some of the important drugs that change their influence. And going forward, we're going to be getting into individual specific drugs, such as hallucinogens or such as stimulants, that consistently have similar effects to one another. And again, this is a foundation, in this case, of the major types of neurotransmitters that we can then build on to talk about the actions of specific drugs. So, two quick terms. An agonist is any drug that makes a neurotransmitter more effective, and an antagonist is any drug that makes a neurotransmitter less effective. So one easy way to remember this is an antagonist in literature or in film studies is another term for a villain. So an antagonist is somebody who blocks the actions of the hero of the story, or an antagonist is somebody who goes around and messes things up. And so an antagonist is any drug that blocks the action of a neurotransmitter or makes a neurotransmitter less able to transmit between cells. And then an agonist is the opposite. It makes neurotransmission more effective and it makes the neurotransmitter more likely to travel between cells. So agonist makes the neural transmission more likely, antagonist makes the neural transmission less likely. All right, so major neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine. As the text mentioned, it is the first neurotransmitter ever discovered, and that is because it is found in the muscles of the body as well as the brain, whereas most of the other neurotransmitters we're going to be talking about are found primarily in the brain. And acetylcholine is associated with sensation and movement. Those two are very closely connected to one another. You have to be able to sense where your body is in order to move it effectively, and moving your body changes the way that you sense things. And then acetylcholine is also associated with memory, which is part of the reason that a loss of acetylcholine receptors appears to be a mechanism in what leads to cognitive decline in Alzheimer's. So acetylcholine is found in the brain and then also in the parasympathetic nervous system, which you'll recall from the video is the area of the nervous system associated with the rest and digest response, or with relaxation during times of basically being able to take a break and maintain bodily processes. So an example of an agonist for acetylcholine is nicotine. So nicotine basically improves the transmission of acetylcholine, which is part of the reason that people under the influence of nicotine report basically an increase in energy, so greater sensation, greater movement, and an easier time with concentration, so easier time using one's memory. The monoamines, as I said, are three very similar neurotransmitters that all share this molecular structure. As you can see on the slide, they share one amine structure. And so the monoamines are serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. And these are the neurotransmitters that we're probably going to be talking about the most this semester because the monoamines serve many different functions within the brain and are associated with some of the higher order functions, such as memory and perception or interpreting sensory information that we see many drugs affect. And as I said many times, because they are packaged similarly, they share some receptors, they share that molecular base, drugs that affect one are likely to affect the other two. It's not a guarantee. There are drugs that only affect one of those transmitters or only two of them, but often we see overlap where a drug that affects one of the monoamines is going to affect the other two as well. So for instance, if a drug affects the vesicles used to package up serotonin, which is true of cocaine, then we see that generally that same structure of vesicle is going to be used for dopamine and norepinephrine. And so we're going to see some of the similar effects on dopamine and norepinephrine as on serotonin when the individual is under the influence of cocaine. So first one, norepinephrine. So norepinephrine is associated with hunger, so your perception of hunger and of fullness, and your degree of arousal. So how alert are you? So if you have very high arousal, then you are oftentimes extremely alert. You might feel anxious. We talk about panic or that state of intense fear in an emergency as being sort of the extreme of arousal. If you have very low arousal, then generally you're not going to be very alert. You're going to be very relaxed. We talk about a coma where you don't respond to any stimuli at all as being the other extreme at the low end of arousal. So norepinephrine is found in the sympathetic nervous system as well as the brain. So the sympathetic nervous system is that division of the nervous system associated with that flight or fight response. So norepinephrine helps to regulate that response. It helps to regulate that startle reflex where you jump back if something suddenly happens. It helps to regulate the pupils dilating and digestion shutting down and other emergency responses within the body, which is why, for instance, if one consumes amphetamines, which are norepinephrine agonists, you see that people under the influence of amphetamines will oftentimes be very alert. They might startle easily. Sometimes they are paranoid or they are reporting that they have sort of free-floating anxiety under the influence of amphetamines, and it's because it increases the action of norepinephrine, or it's an agonist for norepinephrine. Serotonin is sometimes referred to mostly inaccurately as the happy chemical. So serotonin regulates mood and sleep and relaxation. So famously, the tryptophan in turkey, combined with the large amounts of carbohydrates found in other foods that one eats at Thanksgiving, such as mashed potatoes and dinner rolls, can lead to an increase in serotonin in the system, which can then lead to a state of happiness and relaxation and sleepiness after one has a traditional American Thanksgiving dinner. So that's the influence of serotonin. So an example of a drug that increases the mechanism of serotonin or makes serotonin more effective is lysergic acid or LSD. And so the experience of unrealness that a lot of people describe under the influence of LSD and that state of intense relaxation and drifting away and being able to just sort of sit there and stare at a wall for 12 hours without ever feeling bored or impatient or restless. That's the influence of serotonin or the influence of LSD on the serotonin system. So dopamine is associated with movement, with perception, And it's most famous, especially among psychopharmacologists, for regulating reward. So it's associated with both the want and the like functions of reward. So, for instance, if you anticipate that you are going to be going swimming with your friends later today, and you feel that kind of positive spike of happiness, you're looking forward to going swimming with your friends later today, that's dopamine. It's causing you to experience that wanting sensation, or it's saying, yeah, this is going to be a rewarding experience. It's probably going to be pleasantly physically taxing. It's probably going to be social in a way that's really rewarding. And so if you have that, oh, hey, I just remembered I'm going swimming with friends later. That's dopamine at work. And then when you're actually swimming with your friends and you're having a good time and you're laughing, etc., that is also dopamine at work. So that's the like function where you're saying, yeah, you know what? I'm enjoying this. I could come back here. I could do this again some other time. So dopamine is very, very sensitive to rewards. And so an example of an agonist for dopamine, cocaine. So, no wonder cocaine causes people to be happy, but also no wonder cocaine over long use causes people to be really, really unable to want things other than cocaine. So people who have used cocaine for a long time will often report that they don't enjoy non-cocaine anything anymore. They might say, yeah, I used to really, really love hugging my puppy at the end of a long day, and now I'm just kind of apathetic. He's just kind of there. Or, yeah, I used to get such a huge enjoyment out of going for a really long run, and now it just doesn't do it for me. I don't find roller coasters exciting. I don't find my favorite TV shows engaging. But you know what? I can't stop thinking about how much I want cocaine and how much I like cocaine, because it basically changes the structure of the dopamine system over long use. Again, we're going to revisit cocaine later, and it's really an interesting drug in that it has very widespread effects across many different neurotransmitter systems, but that's one example of its effects. So endorphins, moving out of the monoamines, are naturally occurring morphine-like substances. So endorphin is supposed to be endogenous, as in naturally occurring within the body, morphine, or a naturally occurring opiate-like substance. So we discovered morphine first, and then we discovered how morphine has its effect, which is the reason that this somewhat backwards naming structure occurred. So we discovered that when you inject somebody with morphine, if they're in pain, they stop being in pain, which is awesome. It was a huge medical breakthrough. And then we discovered that the way that that happens is that there's this neurotransmitter, referred to as endorphins, that basically is used by the body naturally to block the experience of pain. So if any of you are runners and you've heard of the runner's high, it's when you've been running for a long time, you start to feel pain in your joints, you start to feel exhaustion. Sometimes your lungs are becoming painful because you've been breathing heavily for a very long time. And then all of a sudden, the pain disappears and this really enjoyable high feeling washes over you. So that is your body manufacturing endorphins, because your body is correctly detecting that that your joints are starting to hurt. That there's some damage to your joints. There's no point in continuing to send that pain signal, not while you need to continue using your joints. So stop that. Block off the pain and instead send a spike of energy and enjoyment and, again, basically pain killing throughout the body. So if you have had that experience, that's your endorphins at work. Also, if you've ever been in a situation where you're injured and immediately after the injury, you kind of get this high floating feeling. So I remember when I broke my arm, on the way to the hospital, I sort of burst into uncontrollable giggles over some comment that in retrospect wasn't even that funny, and was sort of high and loopy. the whole way to the hospital. And so that was my body sending out endorphins. It was like, okay, we got the message. The arm is broken. And there really isn't much point in continuing to have this pain signal go through. So we're going to block that pain signal. And since this seems to be an emergency, we're going to send a spike of energy and positive mood through the body as well, in the hope that that will help fight off the injury or the source of the injury. So obviously, as I've said, morphine works by stimulating endorphins or by mimicking endorphins. But an example of an antagonist for the endorphin system, or a drug that blocks the effects of endorphins, is naloxone. So it's used to reverse overdoses of opiates, so morphine, heroin, Oxycontin, etc., through basically cutting off their ability to continue to have that effect. So you no longer get the high, you no longer get the pain-killing effects of the heroin, but you also don't die from the heroin. So it's a very, very beneficial drug. And like morphine, it's a major medical breakthrough. So GABA. I'm not going to get into the full name because nobody uses the full name, much like ecstasy. So it is a major inhibitory neurotransmitter. So what's really important to know about GABA is that it tends to block action potentials, or when it's released, it makes an action potential less likely to occur in the postsynaptic cell. So it makes everything happen more slowly inside your brain and your body. Again, I'm oversimplifying, but that's the major effect that it's known for, and the major effect we're going to be talking about, especially when we talk about alcohol. So alcohol makes GABA more effective. Again, it's an agonist for GABA, and that's why alcohol slows everything down. It makes you less able to concentrate and think clearly because it's, gumming up the works of your brain. It slows down your heartbeat and your breathing, which is why alcohol is so dangerous when combined with so many other drugs, because it basically it can lead to cardiac arrest, or it can lead to you basically being unable to breathe effectively anymore as a result of combination with other drugs. And it slows down reflexes. So that's why drunk driving is associated with so many fatalities every year. Is if something suddenly happens, somebody drives into an intersection as you're approaching, or you see a stop sign that you had not previously noticed, you're going to be far, far slower at hitting the brake or swerving out of the way, or even just turning into a curve in the road than you would normally be, because of all the GABA flooding your system, and you are liable to get into an accident. And unfortunately, there's thousands and thousands of fatalities every year from exactly that effect. And then glutamate is the major excitatory neurotransmitter. So it makes action potentials more likely in the receiving cell. And it, again, I am vastly oversimplifying, but what its major effect appears to be, and what it's really known for, is making chemical signals travel more quickly through the body. And so everything happens more quickly and more effectively under the influence of drugs that make glutamate more effective. So an example of a glutamate antagonist, so it makes action potentials less likely because it makes glutamate not travel as much through the system, is ketamine, sometimes known as Special K. Originally developed as a tranquilizer. So it has that tranquilizing effect, or it leads to sleepiness, calmness, changes in perception. Basically, the individual becomes kind of very limp under the influence of ketamine because it makes glutamate less effective. And so the body is basically less able to use its neurotransmitters, and action potentials are traveling more slowly. And ketamine can also lead to hallucinations under high doses, specifically a pattern of hallucinations that I've tried to convey with this image on the slide, involve delays in one's vision and basically poor coordination of one's vision with one's understanding of what one's actually seeing. And that's because ketamine makes glutamate less effective, and in the process, those basically processes of seeing and perceiving what you're seeing become less effective.